Hello and welcome to this short presentation. We will be talking about Eusebius of Caesarea. Eusebius was one of the great church fathers of the early church. He was born between 260 AD to 265. Nobody really knows exactly when he was born, but it is generally believed that he was born between 260 AD and 265 AD, and he lived until 339 AD. In this presentation, I'll be looking at his early life, and I'll also be looking at his works, his contribution in the heresy of Arianism, this being one of the heresies that faced the early church. And I'll also be talking about his contribution in the Council of Nicaea and his role in the development of the Nicene Creed. And I'll also be talking about his contribution in the formation of the Imperial Church. And finally, we'll conclude with a few thoughts about this great father of the church, Eusebius of Caesarea. First of all, it is important to note that Eusebius of Caesarea is recognized as the father of the church history. Indeed, some scholars argue that if Herodotus was the father of history, then Eusebius of Caesarea was the father of church history. He was a great admirer of Constantine. Constantine was the emperor of Rome. He is the emperor who converted to Christianity during the time when the church was facing great persecutions. And when he was converted and he became himself a Christian, there were great changes in the entire life of the church. And Eusebius was such a great admirer of Constantine. Eusebius is also known as a great scholar, a theologian, a historian, and a great writer. He is also known as a bishop of Caesarea, one of the provinces of the Empire of Rome. How about his early life? It is not so much known about him. Indeed, as I have just alluded in just a few minutes, he was born between 260 AD and 265 AD. Not much is known about him, and there are no records that could help us understand much about his early life. But all we know is that he was probably born in Palestine, and not much is known about his parents or his siblings. He spent most of his time in Caesarea, thus his name Eusebius of Caesarea. In terms of his education, he was educated, or rather he was a disciple of one great man by the name Pamphilus, and that is how he also acquired the name Eusebius of Pamphilus. He is one man who was known to admire great people, and he admired his mentor so much that at some point he changed his name and he called himself after his mentor, thus the name Eusebius of Pamphilus. He studied in Oregon's library, which was maintained at the church in Caesarea. And therefore, he was very passionate of Origen's theology, and he even wrote a defense for this work. I'll be talking more about this work I'll be talking more about this defense in his work just in the next in the next slide. He was, in terms of his career, he was a bishop of Caesarea, and he was most ardent admirer of Emperor Constantine. Constantine being a great man, Eusebius was a great admirer of what he was doing as a converted Christian and a converted emperor for that matter. He was a great scholar with much influence in his day. Indeed, he is considered one of the bishops of his time who had great influence in the church, even amongst his peers. His work has been cited by many scholars, amongst them Socrates, Jerome, Athanasius, among others. Whereas there is no document that we can be able to read to be able to understand his early life, it is good to appreciate that one person who actually succeeded him as Bishop of Caesarea had done a book, The Life of Eusebius, but unfortunately that work is lost. Among his works, he did a lot of writing, and Eusebius is known for great things that he did, but all this work, some of it has already been lost, but we are so glad that we still can get a lot of what he left behind. His work generally can be divided into 8 different categories. He was involved in writing apologetic works, and in this, he was able to defend the Christian faith. Examples of this work include preparation for the gospel. In these works, he argued against polytheism as base for Christian faith. He also did Bible dictionaries, and then these examples are the names of places in the Holy Scriptures and a chronograph of ancient Judea, which unfortunately is also lost. He also did doctrinal works, where he wrote 10 books entitled General Elements, but only fragments survive, with books number 6 to 9, which were put together as an independent unit, which we now know as prophetic extracts. Eusebius also did exegetical writings, and here he did so much in terms of explaining things like the genealogy of Jesus as presented by Evangelist Luke, and the genealogy of Jesus as presented by Evangelist Matthew, and how the two are not in conflict. That's just one example of the exegetical writings that he did. He also did letters, and not many of these letters are available for us today, but we have some which show the communication, the correspondence he had with Alexandria, and especially in regard to the heresy of Arius. In terms of orations, he must have been a great orator, because among the orations that we have are when he was invited to make an oration on the 20th and 30th anniversary celebration for the reign of Constantine. And other things that he did was polemic writings. And with polemic writings, this includes among some of the notable works in this category is the defense of Origen, which I said, which I have just mentioned, was done by himself and his mentor, Pamphilus. This is when Pamphilus was in prison just before martyrdom, or before he was killed because of his faith. And together they had done 5 chapters, but Eusebius was able to add an extra chapter after Pamphilus had died. But perhaps Eusebius is better known for his historical writings. In this, he was able to write a chronology of the events of the Christian church from the 1st century to his time. And this is what we call the history of the church. Other books that he did, or other works he did under historical writings, include the life of Constantine. Being a great admirer of Constantine, he was able to document so much about him and all that he had known about Constantine. How did he get involved in the heresy of Arianism? And what is this heresy all about? First of all, heresy of Arianism was just one of the many other heresies that the early church faced. But this was very unique in the sense that it came soon after the end of persecution era. And it was at a time when the church was looking forward for peace and calm, and they were not really ready for anything that was in the manner that this heresy came. They were looking forward to seizing the opportunities of growth and development and even greater evangelism now that persecution had come to a close. But one priest by the name Arius of Alexandria, serving under the Bishop Alexander of Alexandria, he developed, or he came up with this great controversy, which was later to be known as heresy of Arianism. He contested on the deity of Christ. And he, being such an influential person, he was able to mobilize people all over Alexandria and beyond. And they came up with a motto that there was a time when where he here refers to the Son, Jesus Christ, as a Son of God, there was a time when he was not. Initially, he reached out to people whom he thought would be able to support him. And that is how Eusebius of Caesarea came in. Eusebius was seemingly sympathetic of this whole issue of Arius, but it's not that he was hypocrite or an opportunist that he eventually changed his mind, but it is generally understood that perhaps he just never knew what was at stake. So when the heresy controversy became a big issue and it came to the attention of the emperor was able to dispatch a task force that was to find out what is it all about and to solve it. But as it were, it became an issue bigger than what they thought, and the matter had to be brought before the Council of Bishops. And the council that was called the Council of Nicaea, and this was done bringing together all the bishops. And this was the first time that Emperor Constantine was bringing the bishops together. So this challenge that started in Alexandria with Arius and the bishop had finally brought in other people on board. Amongst them was Eusebius of Nicomedia and also Bishop Eusebius of Caesarea. This one was caught in between. What was in contest? What was the issue here? As I've just mentioned, the controversy was on the deity of Christ. Arius believed that the Son is not eternally existing and is not of the same substance with the Father, and that he is a creature, the firstborn of creation, and that means that there was a time when he was not. Now, Arius not being a bishop, he was not admitted in the Council of Bishops, and therefore he needed someone to represent him, and that was Eusebius of Nicomedia. And when Eusebius of Nicomedia presented his case before the bishops, he was not ready with what he found, because the bishops were not in support of that theology, and they rejected it in total. And they realized the gravity of this matter, and to that extent, they decided to come up with a creed that's going to be circulated to all the churches. And this was to ensure that Arianism as a heresy is not tolerated in any church across the empire. Furthermore, anyone who was following Arius or was in support of this heresy was to be anathematized. Therefore, the decision was they had to come up with a creed, and since none was prepared, indeed the bishops were not prepared for this, as it were, in their minds, the unity of the church was of paramount importance. And they thought that they would be able to meet with the emperor, being their very first time. They would be able to address other issues, and perhaps the issue of Arius would be a small matter. And therefore, there were no drafts. But this is where Eusebius of Caesarea came in. Incidentally, he suggested, for whatever reason, scholars are not able, they still debate on why he had to suggest this. But he suggested that the creed that was operational in his church, if they could consider it. And when it was presented, the bishops reviewed it and they thought it was okay. But Emperor Constantine added that there should be an element of that the Son is of the same substance with the Father. And with that small addition, the creed that was used at Eusebius Church was finally adopted for circulation in all the churches across the empire. This creed came to be known as Nicene Creed. How did he get involved in the formation of the imperial church? First of all, Eusebius was very much convinced that Constantine had been raised up by God, especially having come from an era of persecution. He felt that this was a great time when God had visited the church. And there was also an understanding that both philosophy and the Hebrew scriptures were given as a preparation for the gospel. And what therefore had taken place in the person of Constantine completely changed his perspective, especially on the history of the church. So Eusebius was able to bring together various ideas in the verifiable facts of the history of both the church and the empire. And with this theological perspective, it made it very difficult for Eusebius to take a critical stance on the events of his time. He had really to support the emperor because he believed that Constantine's conversion was a keystone for the progression of the church. As he was admiring the many things that were happening there, including the new churches that the emperor was now able to open and the freedom that the church had finally found, there are a number of things that were also happening. And one of them is that the gospel, or the good news, was now not just the good news to the poor, but it was also good news to the rich. With the example of Eusebius, or rather the example of the emperor leading them, it was now, the people now were able to appreciate the gospel that both the rich and the poor, they had a place in the good news. One more thing that was happening is that the people who are being persecuted, they are now people who are meeting and interacting with those that were in power. By that, Eusebius, and indeed people of his time, they never knew that aristocracy that was in the government that time, or in the empire, was also finding its way in the church. And finally, one more thing that was happening, this was really completely out of control of Eusebius, but it was happening in his time, is that the church saw the conversion of Constantine as though the reign of God had been fully fulfilled. And like before, when they were feeling and thinking of that time of reigning of God becoming a reality, with this, they felt like it was not a not yet, but it had now happened. And this was a big challenge. Although Eusebius does not talk about it or was not able to address some of these things, it is important to appreciate that they were indeed beyond his control, but they were happening in his time. What conclusions can we draw out of the life of Eusebius? Number one is that Eusebius of Caesarea, he remains a great personality in the history of the church. If you look at what he was able to put together, evaluating thoroughly the work from the first century, the work of, it gives us a lot of confidence. And though much of his work has been lost, the much that we have in opposition is invaluable gem in understanding the roots of our Christian faith and the journey that we have come since the first century. And finally, his contribution is a pointer to how much Christian theology was being shaped by the new circumstances in the life of the church, and also how much the church was and still can influence the society, even to the point of abandoning some of its traditional themes. Thank you.